We are increasingly seduced, not just by the sort of fast-moving, amazing, bright, shiny digital world, but by the narratives that are woven for us on that world. And to see now that younger people in the US and many other countries get most of their news and their entertainment from YouTube, and you just don't know what you're getting. A lot of what you're getting is taking you down a filter bubble, a silo bubble that is confirming prejudices that may already exist.
Hello and welcome to Ways to Change the World. I'm Krishnan Murthy, and this is the podcast in which we talk to extraordinary people about the big ideas in their lives and the events that have helped shape them. And my guest today is the author of a new book called Don't Be Evil, The Case Against Big Tech. Don't be evil, of course, the original Google motto. And it's by Rana Foroohar, who was a business columnist for the Financial Times and an analyst for CNN. The case against big tech, lay it out for us.
Well, big tech is a monopoly power. It is eroding liberal democracy, and it is literally changing our brains. I mean, there are so many stories here, and what my book tries to do is really get at the 20-year arc of how these firms, the Googles, the Apples, Amazon, Netflix, Facebook, how they went from being these sort of utopian ideals, people working in a garage, coming up with great ideas, to being part of the dystopia that we now live in, where we have election meddling, we have video game addiction, and we have a sense that the digital economy is increasingly becoming a zero-sum game. So I tried to put all those dots together and come up with a why are we here, how did we get here?
Well, let's break it down a little bit then. I mean, commercially, a lot of these tech giants, have a simple explanation or defense of their own behavior, which is we're offering you a service. You don't have to use it.
Right.
Google say, well, we don't charge you. You have great benefit from our services, and we make a bit of money on the side through advertising. Amazon say, well, you can go to the high street if you'd rather pay more.
Yeah.
So how have we been drawn in, if you like, by these people to the point where they have the kind of financial power that small country or big countries do?
One of the fascinating stats I came across in my book research was that 80% of corporate value is now living in 10% of firms that are the richest in intellectual property and data. So most of those are the big tech platform firms, the big commercial tech firms in the US. Now, how did they get that way? In part because the superstar effect, which you can already sort of see in big multinational firms, is particularly potent when you shift into a world of data. So these companies can come in, they'll tell you competition is only a click away. Well, believe me, if Google goes down and you can't get online for your search, you're more likely to go walk around the block, have a cup of coffee than you would be to use Bing. This is not just like going into a shop and picking a different shirt. These companies go in, they ring fence entire areas very quickly, control all the data and all the commerce within those areas, and then it's very, very difficult for any competitor to get in. So that's why you've seen huge monopoly positions developing. In most markets, if you have over, say, a 35% share, that starts to get into the realm of monopoly. Google has a 90+% share in search. Same again for Facebook and social media. Same again for Amazon and e-commerce. These are companies that are really modern monopolies, very similar in some ways to the 19th century robber barons that built the railroads. That is the level of wealth and power that we're talking about.
How do you think we were seduced by this whole world? Because they looked different, they sounded different, they seemed to do business in a different way. Their offices were funky and cool, and they gave away free food. And this is what we're all obsessed with, rather than what they were actually about.
That's true. And they're the reasons that we're all working in cubicles now. So the free food is okay, the cubicle not so much. It's interesting. In the early 1990s, early to mid 1990s, which is really when the commercial internet began, it was kind of a fun place. I'm old enough that I was reporting in Silicon Valley back then, and I remember going not to meet the Google guys, but to meet the Yahoo guys. At the time, Yahoo was the big, cool company that everybody wanted to beat. And everyone was walking around in flip-flops, and it's California, and the sun is shining. And, they were considered different, and so they got special carve-outs, which we are now dealing with the ramifications of. So in 1996, there was some legislation that allowed internet companies to remain not liable for anything that people would do or say on their platforms. Now, you and I both know, working in traditional media, if we come on and make up a load of lies and rubbish here, we're liable for it. We can be sued. There are real consequences. But not if you're Google, not if you're Facebook. And that's one of the reasons that we've gotten to the place where we're kind of living in a post-truth world now, because as we get more and more of our media and our content from these platforms, and fake news spreads 6 times as fast as real news, an MIT study recently showed that, we don't know what's truth and what's not. And we are increasingly seduced, not just by the sort of fast-moving, amazing, bright, shiny digital world, but by the narratives that are woven for us on that world. And it's fascinating to me. I mean, I have 2 younger children, and this is one of the reasons I wrote this book. My son became a video gaming addict, and I can tell you about that story. But to see now that younger people in the U.S. and many other countries get most of their news and their entertainment from YouTube, and you just don't know what you're getting. A lot of what you're getting is taking you down a filter bubble, a silo bubble that is confirming prejudices that may already exist.
So what is it that you're really objecting to most? Is it their monopoly position?
Yeah, monopoly position, and also the way in which these firms have not taken any responsibility for the negative things that they've wrought. I mean, they've given us a lot of great stuff, right? A lot of nifty gadgets. We now all have more computing power in our pockets than most companies had 20 years ago in their entire firm. But they've eroded liberal democracy. You look at countries where social media usage is rising, trust in liberal democracy is falling. They've created...
Have they eroded liberal democracy, or have we using their tools?
We have using their tools, but the thing is, you have to regulate tools and products when they aren't serving society. I mean, I actually think of these products a lot the way you think about big tobacco. You know, everybody's mother smoked when they were kids, or many people's did. You know, people used to smoke when they were pregnant. We didn't know that these things were bad for us, but that's why we have politicians and regulators who are supposed to create boundaries. I mean, capitalists will go in and do whatever they can without regulation, and that's the point that we're at now.
Do you think it matters because of the monopoly in itself, or because of what the monopoly power has given them in terms of their political influence?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think it would be a problem even if it were just a monopoly effect. And one of the interesting things is, because I'm a business reporter, when I began to think about these things and write about these things in the Financial Times, I started getting calls from entrepreneurs, venture capitalists in many areas from many different walks of life saying, you know what, this is a real problem just for the economic ecosystem, that we can't get into certain areas where the big players are already there. There's kind of black zones of innovation where nobody can get in because they've ring-fenced all the data. So that in and of itself is an economic issue, but when you layer onto that, these companies, Google and Amazon, for example, are the biggest corporate lobbyists in the US, oftentimes the biggest in Brussels, in London. That adds a layer of power that is really disturbing to me.
Just for those people who aren't sure what you mean when you say they've ring-fenced the data.
Yeah.
Why do they have this kind of power? And what do you mean by the data?
Yeah.
What is it that they have that somebody innovating from scratch doesn't have?
So when you go to do a search for anything, you probably did 3 or 4 or 5 searches today already. You go to Google. When you go to Google, they are tracking what you're doing. If you have a camera, your eyes are, in some cases, being followed. If you have an Android phone, it knows what you're doing. It knows where you're shopping. It might know what aisle you're in the grocery store. All that data, and that's historic over the period of your life that you've been on the internet, and sometimes even off the internet, because now in the world of sensors and smart cars, you can be tracked even when you're not at a computer online or on your phone. All that information is being collated, and it's developing a picture about who you are. That picture is then being sold to advertisers. The advertisers can then target you, really down to the nth degree in a way that is entirely new. And your purchasing decisions can then be shifted because the algorithms can take you places that you may or may not have chosen to go, but it may be in Google or Amazon's or Facebook's interest for you to go to those places. And this is huge business. And your data, by the way, is the resource that's being mined for free, which is, one of the reasons that these firms make higher profit margins with lower amounts of labor costs than any other kind of company in history.
What a lot of people I think, they'll respond to that with, why should I care?
Yeah. Well, do you care about politics? Do you care about the fact that these platforms have been used to manipulate elections, on both sides of the Atlantic? They've been used to encourage genocide in some emerging market countries. In China, they're being used as a kind of an unprecedented surveillance state. China is actually, of course, there's no privacy debate in China because of the Communist Party. So everything that you do or say is tracked online. And then you have a system of social credits that means that if you are doing or saying the right things, you get a check and you can go forward. And if you don't, you might not get a mortgage or health care. It's like a bad episode of Black Mirror. That's really serious. And George Soros, who was one of my sources, has made the point that in an era in which the algorithms know more about you than you might about yourself and can lead you to certain decisions, do we even have free will? Do we even have, what John Stuart Mill would call free will? That is a profound question. And what's interesting is we have not had a clear and open debate about this as a society. For the and this is part of a bigger conversation about capitalism. For the last 40 years or so, we've been consumers. As long as prices are going down and we get more stuff that we can buy, it's all good. I think we're moving to an era in which we're going to be more citizens, and that's a very different thing than being a consumer, and that involves making some decisions about how we want capitalism and how we want big tech to function.
When you say they are now the biggest lobbyists, so they've taken over from oil and gas?
Year on year, it depends on, what kind of legislation is going, but they're generally as a category, they're right behind Big Pharma. In terms of the two largest corporate lobbyists in Washington, it's Google and Amazon. Google actually took the highest number of meetings with the White House during the Obama administration of any firm. So they're in the first, second, third category as an industry and in the top two in terms of companies.
And what is that lobbying getting them, do you think?
Well, for example, you've had large shifts in the way intellectual property is valued. So if you go back 20 years or so, somebody comes up with a great piece of software or maybe a cool new drug. You get a patent for it, and the patent allows you a certain amount of time to monetize that, and then it becomes a generic and so on. Well, as these firms began to grow, and particularly as they got into the smartphone business, they wanted to see patents being harder to get because they need lots and lots of intellectual property in their own products. So they wanted to make it harder for Joe, individual entrepreneur, to protect their innovation and easier to take all that open source and then use their own legal might to protect what they needed to protect. So you had an entire reshaping of the patent system in the US, which serves the Googles and the Facebooks and the Apples and the Ciscos, but it doesn't necessarily serve small and mid-sized businesses. That's one great example, and it goes to the fact that you're getting this zero-sum game where these companies are as big in terms of market cap as the large industrials of the past, but they create a fraction of the number of jobs. So you start to get this sense that the whole economic ecosystem is being hollowed out.
I guess a lot of our conversation so far has been about Google. I mean, Google say...
Yeah.
You can turn it off. You can turn off the tracking. You can delete your data. You can be forgotten if you want to.
Well,
Why don't more of us do it?
You can in Europe because of the network effect. I mean, the network effect is such that, and this was what Hal Varian, their chief economist, wrote about in the 1990s. Once you are in the network, it's very, very difficult to pull out of that network and still have the kind of product that you need. Also, being forgotten, signing away rights, checking the box. There's a lot of gobbledygook. You're often looking at, pages of small print, trying to figure out this is, the burden goes on to you. It's interesting, regulators are starting to think about shifting that burden. Margaret Vestager, for example, the EU competition commissioner, is saying, maybe the burden of saying what they're going to do with the data should be on the tech firms and be very clear and simple. Maybe it should be their problem to tell us and make it clear for us and make it easy for us to opt out if we want. And maybe the search, they shouldn't be able to have to lose access to the entire product if they do want to opt out with certain data limitations. So there's a lot to be figured out, but I think the bottom line here is this is an industry that for 20 years has been categorized as special. They've gotten special rules. very much like finance, actually, in 2008. We're special, we're complicated. Well, really, the good questions are the simple ones. What are you doing for citizens, for consumers, for the business ecosystem at large? And if you're not doing something positive, then let's get rid of it.
And you believe they are the next banks, basically, in terms of how we will see them?
I do. I think it's already going that direction. I mean, right now, just take antitrust for an example. You have a big debate transatlantically about, all right, if you kind of think of these companies as the railroads of today or the utilities of today, I mean, they really are like water or gas or transportation. You need them. So then possibly they should be regulated like utilities and their profit margins should be compressed, or there should be taxes to fund other things. I mean, right now you're having debate in the UK about labor and nationalizing broadband and who should be paying for the rollout. It's kind of interesting because in China, for example, Alibaba, which is their Amazon, actually pays for rural broadband rollout. That's kind of one of the quid pro quos. All right, you can get as big and rich as you want, you can have double-digit profit margins, but you have to help build out broadband for the rest of the country. So I think rich countries are beginning to grapple with these questions. And again, it goes back to this form of sort of neoliberal economics that we've had in the last 40 years, where companies can be as global as they want, but national governments remain tied to the concerns on the ground.
You mentioned the debate we're having in this country around things like free broadband funded by taxing the big tech companies. I mean, do you think these ideas are, ahead of the game? That this is a way of actually hitting, the anger that we're going to feel towards these companies a little early?
I do, and it's interesting. I've seen some of the coverage here about Labor's proposal around broadband and that it's so wild and outside the box. I actually don't really think it is. I mean, in China, big tech companies actually do pay for rural broadband rollout. In the West, there's been a big fight between the cable providers and the telecoms providers and the platforms. I mean, a BT, for example, is responsible for rolling out broadband. That's a lot of money. It makes single-digit profit margins, whereas Google and Facebook are making high double-digit profit margins, monetizing everything they're laying and not having to contribute. I don't know if that's so equal. I think maybe a tech tax to build the infrastructure that would ultimately make things better, not just for individuals, but for the tech firms themselves, is not such a bad idea.
I mean, do you think that could be the beginning of new models? I mean,
swing back to the public sector.
Big business is thinking, well, if they're going to do that, then what are they going to hit us with?
Right.
What's
so
next?
Is this the end of the Thatcher-Reagan revolution?
Yes, but also sort of is it the beginning of a way of looking at targeted tax, a new kind of hypothecated tax, if you like?
Well, that's an interesting question. I guess what I would say is I think we're at a pivot point economically. I mean, if you go back
get Farmer to pay for the NHS.
Well, I think that's less likely than a broad swing back towards power in the public sector. These swings are natural, right? The last swing was the Reagan-Thatcher revolution. From the 80s onward, you had the unions crushed, the public sector lost power, the private sector was unleashed. That was appropriate at the time. The pendulum had swung too far in the opposite direction. But now we've come to a place where the labor share of the pie is at record post-World War II lows. The private sector is at record highs. Stock prices are as high as they've expensive as they've been in 150 years in the U.S. So it's probably time for the pendulum to swing back a bit.
I mean, so this really does involve redesigning capitalism to some degree.
I think so. I think in some ways, I've been thinking about this a lot because you see many kind of economic nationalist politicians in the U.S., for example, Elizabeth Warren, who famously wants to break up big tech. Mark Zuckerberg, the head of Facebook, has actually called Elizabeth Warren an existential threat to Facebook. Well, in a way she is, but perhaps even in a deeper way than he imagines. Not only would she like to break up these companies, but she would like to curb a system of globalization that has allowed big companies to fly 35,000 feet above the concerns of nation states in which they are born. And I think that's a legitimate thing. I mean, I think that's why we have the politics that we do in the UK, in the US, and many other parts of Europe.
But how would you do it? I mean, breaking up a company itself doesn't stop.
No, that's more of
any
a
of the
slogan.
practices.
That's more of a slogan than a solution. But what I would say is already, and in California, interestingly, which is the birthplace of a lot of these firms, they're starting to talk about, hey, maybe we should have a digital sovereign wealth fund. You look at Norway, for example, a resource-rich country. They've had a very successful use of mineral and oil resources in a sovereign wealth fund. That's one of the reasons that you have such great education and social safety nets in that part of the world. Similarly, in the U.S., Alaska and Wyoming, mineral-rich states, have actually shared some of that resource with citizens. Well, if you think about data as the new oil, as this resource that is being mined from us for free right now, well, why should some of that value not go back to the people who are giving it? Consumers, citizens, the public sector in a fund, which could then be used to do things like build infrastructure, fund education, which, by the way, would make this less of a net zero game. Technology, just to be fair, I'm no Luddite. Technology is always the way that you increase productivity and have GDP growth. But that's only the case if education keeps up with the pace of technological change. And in many Western countries since the 1970s, that hasn't been the case. So you've got to have that public sector investment in order to make this a win-win for everyone and not end up with a kind of a hollowed out middle where you've got jobs for PhDs and jobs for burger flippers, but nobody in between.
I mean, I guess some people might say, if I am the if I am the resource that is, and a lot of money is being made from me by big tech, why should the transfer go to the government? Why can't it come to me?
Well, it could, some people, it's interesting, under the Obama administration in the US, there was a big sort of tech summit. And one of the ideas that was floated was, well, maybe Google should just give everybody a check, the same way the government does when you get a tax refund. There's an argument for that. But the thing is, data's value isn't discrete. You go online and you do a search, and that has value. But what has more value is if you go online, do 3 searches, get in your smart car, drive to a shop, make a purchase, use your phone to call an Uber, to do something logistical. It's the layering of that data that has value. And so it's very difficult to piece the individual bits apart. But when taken as a whole, that's billions and billions of dollars of value. And so it's better to think of it as a pie that could then be split.
And I guess also you would find that rich people are worth more than poor people in terms of data, because they've got the money to spend and the smart car and the this and the that.
That's a risk too. And in fact, some researchers have been talking about the risks of algo racism or algo classism, where you get profiles of individuals that could be then given preferential rates for things or special offers. I mean, this already happens. You and I look at different internets. My hotel room might be priced differently than yours. We might get different search results. So there's already that tailoring. But this is one of the reasons why I really do think that we need some serious regulation in the sector. Think about the insurance business, for example. We've only talked about the consumer internet, what we do on our phones, what we do on our computers. As we move into the Internet of Things and we start to get sensors being placed everywhere, in this glass, on this table, in our homes, you could see, for example, and this is already happening in Asia, sensors being placed all around your home. And so the insurance company now knows, are you taking care of your pipes? Are you shoveling the snow off your steps so that somebody doesn't fall and sue themselves? Well, maybe if you are, then you get a discount. But what if your 16-year-old is smoking marijuana in his room and forgetting to put it out? Well, then you get downgraded. Okay, on the one hand, that sounds very efficient and interesting. But on the other hand, what about the people that can no longer be insured at all? Who picks up the tab for them? The public sector? Is there a junk bond industry in insurance that now develops? So you're blowing up collectivism as a model in insurance. That's going to happen in industry after industry. And if we're not careful, we really are going to end up, I fear, in a society in which everyone's on their own and Big Brother really is watching. And I think we have to make sure that that doesn't happen.
Have we finished the case against? Or is there more?
Well, there is more, and I'll share maybe a personal story, if I might. One of the reasons that I got interested in doing this book, firstly, I began working at the FT and started tracking the money. And I found that a lot of the wealth that had flowed out of the financial sector following the great financial crisis had flowed into big tech. And so these firms were holding, as I say, 80% of the private sector wealth pie, much of it in offshore bank accounts. So taxpayers were not receiving the benefit of this, creating fewer jobs, disrupting more industries. But I also had a very personal reason for writing this book. I came home several weeks into my new job, and I opened up a credit card bill, and I looked through, and I noticed a series of small charges in increments of $1.99, $3, $5. And I started looking and tallying them up, and there were over $900 worth of charges. And then I noticed that they were all from the App Store. And I thought, who else has my password? My then 10-year-old son, Alex. Turns out he had become completely addicted to an online video game, a soccer game, football game, that was free. And I put free in quotation marks because, as you know, many of these games are given to you for free, but then you're pulled through the game and offered purchasing, in-app purchases, they call them, or loot boxes sometimes. And, if you want your team to do better, you have to buy virtual Ronaldo, and you buy them in gold coins and so on and so forth. Well, he had been spending so much time on this game that he had racked up over $900 worth of charges. So I went down to kind of interview him about this. And the more I learned, the more horrified I became as a mother, but the more interested I became as a journalist, because it turns out that a lot of these technologies were very purposely designed. They use casino gaming techniques. They use behavioral techniques, B.F. Skinner and clickers, dogs salivating from clickers. And they're all piled into apps and devices, and they are designed to keep us all online as long as possible so they can sell us stuff and harvest our data. And that business model, what another author, Shoshana Zuboff, would call surveillance capitalism, is now increasingly the business model for almost everyone. In fact, I did an FT column just recently looking at how it's coming into healthcare, it's coming into finance, it's coming into education.
I mean, the return to your example is obviously, well, you gave your 10-year-old your password. What do you expect? He's 10.
Yeah. Well, 2 words.
So it was your responsibility, not theirs.
It is, but it's also the responsibility of the industry. I mean, think about, again, go back to the cigarette analogy or vaping. It's the responsibility of regulators to control an industry that is knowingly selling something that is making us sick. In the case of children, it's very interesting. This is a kind of a nascent research field because these devices are so new. But there's some research to show that since about 2011, 2012, which is when pretty much every kid started getting a smartphone, rates of anxiety, depression, self-harm, loneliness have all been going up, particularly in teenagers, because if you think about it, social media puts on steroids that kind of very insecure, insular world that a lot of teenagers already live in. So I think that we do need to think about health implications. I think that maybe you even want to have, say, an FDA of big tech so that these things could be studied and appropriately curbed.
So where have you gone in terms of what are the things we should look at?
Yeah. So I would point to 3 different areas. So in economics, I would say we need to think of these platform companies, again, like railroads. So back in the day, you were a railroad baron, you owned the track. You might also own the cars that ran on the track, and you might own the things that were in the cars, the coal, the grains, the products. That is just clearly an anti-competitive position because essentially you are both running the network on which commerce operates and also directing the commerce. So that can't be an even playing field. I think we're going to see breakups to the extent that if you're Amazon, maybe you get to be the big e-commerce platform, but maybe you don't get to actually engage in commerce yourself on that platform. Or if you do, you have to be much more transparent about the terms and make sure that people understand that products are being displayed and people are being allowed to get to them equally.
So just to break that down into what that actually means. So you mean Amazon could literally just be a shop window through which other people sell?
Exactly. And that way we would know that, they're not preferencing their own products. Or in the case of voice assistants, that if I ask Alexa something about a political candidate, then I'm not getting an answer first about what Jeff Bezos wants. So that's point number 1. On the political front, I think that these companies have to start policing political advertising in particular. I mean, the idea that we are getting repeated in the US and in Europe, Russian, Iranian election meddling, we're getting people going deep into filter bubbles that are creating polarized politics that is putting literally, it's not an exaggeration to say, putting liberal democracy at risk. I think that is a huge problem. So just make it an even regulatory playing field. And then on the cognitive side, I really do think that we should be moving towards an FDA of big tech. I think we need a body of researchers that look at these products, look at how they're marketing to kids, look at the effects on our brains, and then make some judgment calls.
Eventually, a lot of these big companies do respond. Twitter with its political advertising ban, Instagram responding to the self-harm campaign and trying to stop images of self-harm on their platform. I mean, in general, do you think they respond sincerely, or are they always dragging their feet?
I think they're always dragging their feet. I think it takes a crisis, and oftentimes it takes a big crisis, and then sometimes there's lip service, and then business practices go back to what they were. Ultimately, we shouldn't ask these firms to be in charge of making up the rules themselves. We should put the rules in place, and then they should follow them.
Let's talk about the politics a little bit more. I mean, you're making quite a big statement in terms of the amount of meddling and the effect of it. You know, aren't we still at the stage where we don't really know?
I don't know that we are at that stage. I mean, you know, intelligence bodies in numerous countries have found that there has been election meddling, but it doesn't really matter if it's just Russia or Iran doing the election meddling. Far right and far left-wing parties and autocrats globally have used these platforms in ways that are unique to the platform structure to further their own gains, and in some cases run campaigns of hate. You know, this is a really serious problem. I just think it's unconscionable that the corporations that put these products out there don't have to take any responsibility for the effects in this way.
And how would you regulate that? Because obviously self-regulation would be a disaster.
I think you have to, absolutely it would. And I'm also, just to be fair, I'm also sympathetic to people that say, well, I don't want Mark Zuckerberg deciding what should be censored or what shouldn't. Well, I agree. But I think that governments need to put up some boundaries around this, just as the way that the FT or ITV or traditional media firms would have certain rules in place about what they can and can't say to their viewers or listeners or readers. I think that we've got to have some rules for the platform.
But is it practically possible? I mean, you know, I think
it is.
One of the reasons the internet isn't regulated the same way as Channel 4 or the BBC or anything like that is there's been this assumption that it's too big. You know, you can't, you have to have thousands of people.
That's what big banks said. That's what any industry that wants special rules say. They say, we're special, we're too complex, we're too big. You know why Facebook and Google have high double-digit profit margins? It's in part because they don't employ that many people. Guess what? It is hard to police everything. It is hard to look and take responsibility for your content. Does that mean that they shouldn't do that? No, I don't think so.
And they should pay for it?
Absolutely, and they well can, given that they're now controlling 80% of the corporate wealth hoard.
Again, I mean, in terms of their involvement and their culpability for it, if you like, what do you believe and what can you prove about the extent to which
they knew.
It just happened?
Yeah.
You know, you design any system, people will exploit it, or whether they knew what was going on?
That's a very good question. I do kind of create a narrative arc about when did they know there was a problem with evil. And what's fascinating is you can go back to the very first paper that Larry Page and Sergey Brin, the founders of Google, did in 1998. It was an academic piece looking at what Google would be, kind of describing what this search engine is, how it would work, and then how you might pay for it. And if you read all the way to the end, the appendix section, there's a paragraph on targeted advertising. And they actually come out and say, you know, it's quite possible that if you have a search engine funded by targeted advertising, you're going to end up with a situation in which the interests of the companies or entities that are trying to reach consumers and users are not the same as the interests of those users. And that could lead to the sorts of problems that we have now. So in a way, 20 years ago, they were already predicting where we were. But of course, and you know, in the beginning, Google actually didn't want to do targeted advertising. They did think it was evil. Of course, as they got a bit closer to the IPO, the venture capitalists said, you know, we kind of need a business model for this. What do you think that's going to be?
But the political
and then you start to make those decisions.
The political manipulation isn't really on Google, though, is it? It's Facebook.
No, political manipulation can be done absolutely on YouTube. YouTube is a Google product. I mean, any platform, Twitter, can be used for political manipulation. In fact, there was an MIT study recently that found that fake news on Twitter traveled 6 times as fast as real news, and it stayed around longer.
But in terms of where the real culprits are,
oh, I think all the platform firms are. Yeah, it's the nature of these firms. I mean, when you have kind of unchecked, viral media that's rife, and also a black box where they don't have to declare what's political, what's not, who, are these statements truthful. It's just rife with fake news.
I mean, because I know, having interviewed Google executives a couple of times, that they feel, I think, hard done by, lumped in the same category as Facebook. Because
How do you agree with that? Do you think they're hard done by?
I think there's an argument to be made, which is that Facebook and WhatsApp, we have seen the direct political effect. Mm-hmm. Have we seen the same direct political effect from YouTube yet? I'm not sure.
I think that one of the tactics at this moment of techlash that the big companies like to use is they like to throw around a lot of complex jargon and make people think they're in different categories. Essentially, all these folks are in Washington arguing for the same things. Don't break us up. Don't regulate us. They're even going so far, and Google is very much case in point, to say we're the American national champions. We're going to protect you against China, which is such a laugh, frankly, because these firms are, global profit-making companies, and they want to be anywhere they can.
Twitter's banned political ads.
Has done, yeah.
How important is that?
Pretty important, because it means that they're coming out and saying, yeah, we should do this, and it can be done. You were asking earlier, well, how can you possibly do this? The internet's so big. They can keep child pornography off if they want. That it's about putting more resources and more people on it.
But banning political ads doesn't stop or even really limit political messages or political lies, does it?
No, but it means
because
that
people just do it through accounts rather than through advertising.
Can do, but at a mass level, I think it does have an impact. And I think also it's about creating an equal playing field at a time when most people, particularly most young people, are now getting their news and their information and their entertainment on these platforms. They should simply be liable for the same things that traditional media is. There's just no way around it. They are essentially acting like traditional media companies. They are giant advertising firms.
So would you ban political ads on all social media platforms?
I'd love to do that. I think the world would probably be a better place if we did.
And what do you think will happen if we don't get a grip on this?
I honestly think our political system is at stake, because in the U.S., but to a certain extent in Europe, the big tech companies have so embedded in Washington, and their agendas have become so enmeshed with those of political leaders that I think the public is aware that there really is this rigged game. And as job disintermediation goes higher and higher up the food chain. So, the robots are already doing factory jobs. The software are already taking the place of accountants and litigators and, journalists in some cases. As that goes higher and higher up and people feel more and more threatened by technology, unless you really put it in check, bolster the things like education that need to be bolstered for this to be a win-win, I think you're going to get a real backlash, not just to these firms, but to our system of free market capitalism in general. And that's not a good thing, given that the system has created more wealth than any other in history. They
are clearly aware, the tech companies, that they are sort of at the gates of
under
a PR hell.
Yeah. Although they keep going into it. I mean, every time Mark Zuckerberg goes up on the Hill, it's PR hell.
But I mean, you can see that they know that things are changing and things are turning. So I wonder what do you think the sensible way for them to behave would be now? To just volunteer. I mean, because a lot of them say, look, you design a system and we'll live within your rules.
It's interesting. They know they're under fire, but one of the problems is, and this kind of goes back to this idea of the internet being so different 20 years ago than it is now. These firms are huge firms. They have, in some cases, nearly 100,000 people at Google, or less so at Facebook, but certainly at Google. But yet they act like small firms still. So I could go and talk to the head of content at Google and get one message, and I could talk to an engineer over here and get another. They're dealing with things, but they tend to deal with them in a way that's quite piecemeal. They also have a very small funnel where the top decisions, the important stuff, still goes through about 2 or 3 people. Their corporate governance structures aren't particularly strong. I mean, just look at Facebook as an example of that. And so they're not really geared up in the way that some bigger companies and more mature companies would be to really take a stand back and say, okay, we've got this big 360 problem. We need to think about how economics, politics, behavioral science, everything flows in.
I'm not trying to trip you up, but I'm just wondering whether you sound like you've contradicted yourself in any way, because you just said, Google's got 100,000 people. A little while ago, you were saying they don't have many people and they're not big employers.
No, not compared to their market cap. If they were for their market cap, they would have had 5 times these many people in the past if they were a big industrial firm. What I'm saying is the nature of employment changes. When you're making software and when you're essentially doing commerce and data, you just don't need as many people. That's actually that's a big sort of wonky economic point that a lot of people in my world are thinking about right now. So when all the wealth and power is held by a few firms that deal in software and data, they don't have to go make factories. They don't have to, pull in all these different industries that might have been creating jobs in the past. So the entire nature of the economy and investment into the economy changes, and we haven't really thought about the ramifications of that either.
How long have you been out there sort of making the case against them?
Well, my book came out about 2 weeks ago, but I've been researching and thinking about this for about 3 years.
Have they hit back?
Have they hit back? Oh, sure, of course, absolutely.
So what have you come up against?
Well, there's a lot of soft capture. One of the things I found when I was researching this book, first of all, it's very, very difficult to get independent information from academics or researchers because most of them are bought and paid for by the big tech firms. My bosses have been called a few times. I've been taken off various panels or not invited to certain events that are sponsored by the big companies. But I think, I will say...
They're big enemies to make, aren't they?
Big enemies to make. Although I will say Amazon, to their credit, did put me on the top 20 best nonfiction list. So either Jeff Bezos wasn't watching or maybe they didn't care.
And because your previous book was about
finance. Yeah.
Which is another big, sector to take on. What kind of consequences are there, from your point of view as a journalist, to taking on the people who you're supposed to be covering?
One of the reasons that I was able to write both my first book and this book is I'm now a columnist, so I don't have to go back to these wells for news again and again. I think what happens is the reporters that work in the industries really are hamstrung because they can be locked out of information if they write something very, very critical. They're also dealing with topics that involve a lot of complexity, and so they're vulnerable to the cognitive capture that these firms put forward. Google in particular has done quite an act in the news media. Google and Facebook together give millions, hundreds of millions of dollars to news media. They say that it's to help them bolster the news and democracy, but come on. Do we really want to be taking millions of dollars from the very platform firms that have eaten our lunch because we never should have given away anything for free? But surely that has something to do with the kind of coverage that then results.
So you think we should be very suspicious of Google and Facebook and Apple as commissioners of content?
Yeah. Oh, very much.
Which is what they are now.
If any other advertiser came and said, we'd like to give you $500 million to do whatever content you want, and that there's no strings attached, well, not really. There's always strings attached. There are cognitive strings. I see coverage going in a certain direction or being weakened because people are simply, friendly with the entities that are supporting it.
And so, where do you end up with this? You've laid out your 3 areas.
Yeah. Well, so where I end up is that we are in a digital transformation that is very similar to the Industrial Revolution, right? And that took about 70 years to complete. We're probably in year 20 or so, or 25 of what is going to be a 70 or 100-year revolution. We've been sort of at the tail end now of the consumer internet. We're entering the era of the Internet of Things, in which it's not just going to be us with our devices, it'll be us with our devices connected to machines, our brains connected to machines. There's going to be a depth and breadth of change that we haven't even seen yet. And it's time to take a deep look at this, given that this is going to be the new form of capitalism, and say, how do we want it to work? Because right now, the neoliberal economic ideas that we've lived with for 40 or 50 years, of which these firms are the apex, is not working so well for everybody, which is why we have such extreme politics. And this is a really good time to step back and hopefully, if folks read my book, to find a readable example of where we were, where we've come, and how we might make things work better for the whole.
We like to end with, with giving people the magic wand. If you could just change the world, how would you?
I would encourage people to read. One of the really sad things about the rise of social media and mobile technology, I mean, it's come with a lot of great things and people use it for creativity in a lot of ways, but it's also led to a real decline in reading. Reading numbers are dropping off. Kids in the U.S. read. There was a recent study showing that they read for pleasure only once a month, long-form pieces, e-books, books of any kind. And I think that's a real loss. College professors are starting to complain that kids are coming in, the new generation of digital natives, and they can't even handle the core curriculum reading. And I think if we're going to solve the complex problems of today, we're going to need to keep reading, whether it's on a device or in a hardcover.
Rana Foroohar, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
And I should say after that if you want to hear Google's side of the story, we have also had Matt Britton, who is the president of Google's business and operations in Europe, the Middle East and Africa, on ways to change the world. You can find his interview on YouTube or any podcast app.